All right, good morning.
Morning.
I've been doing a series of lectures on the Fukanzazengi, which are translates as universally recommended instructions for Zazen. So I think this is the fifth talk. The last time when I talked about this, I talked about the I talked about the section that was settle into a steady and mobile sitting position, think, not thinking. How do you think, not thinking, non-thinking? This in itself is the essential art of Zazen. So I'm going to pick up on the Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. That's what's next. Oh, I forgot my reading glasses. So I have to do my best here. The Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. It is the manifestation of ultimate reality. Traps and snares can never reach it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The first part here, the Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. So Dogen, first of all, this idea of learning meditation is an idea that there's some kind of steps and stages practice, something like that, that you're going to learn how to do something. And it is true that Dogen does give us instructions on how to sit Zazen. He tells us what our posture should be. And that last section was about what we should be doing with our mind. But he's saying, essentially, Zazen is not a learning event, that it's not a practice in the sense of some kind of technique that you're using. It is, in its pure essence, it is just our life as we are living it, that is being manifest. So it's a kind of primer, if you will, on how to actually live the rest of our lives besides how to sit Zazen. So in a different fast scroll called Zazen Shin, which means lancet of seated meditation, Dogen talks about the phrase, if you grasp the mark of sitting, okay, if you grasp the mark of sitting, this is not reaching its principle. So to grasp the mark of sitting would be something like getting very rigid and attached to these instructions that Dogen gives us about sitting and what we're doing with our minds. So while we are trying our best to stay in the present moment, as Suzuki Roshi says, don't invite your thoughts to tea. So while that is the instruction that we're engaging in, and yet we are not going to be rigidly attached to that. So that just means keep coming back. And the rigidity would be a kind of judgment, a kind of lack of flexibility, an unwillingness to actually flow with the totality of what's happening around you. So this is not a kind of rigid way of being. Again, the phrase in the Zazen Shin is, if you grasp the mark of sitting, this is not reaching its principle. So this no mark or these characteristics are not something that we cling to. It's just presencing ourselves for our life without unwholesome attachments or delusional thinking. So it's a kind of clear-eyed assessment of your situation as self and other interacting with each other. So that's essentially what the essence of this practice is. So that means that we're not going to characterize, we're not going to hold on to calling it any particular kind of experience, because what we want to do is not have some preconceived idea. So in Zazen, we don't really have some preconceived idea about what it is that we're doing. We're not judging ourselves. We're not saying I'm going to get enlightenment out of this or something like that. It's just we go and we sit and we follow these instructions and we do our best to come back to the present moment. That's it. We don't have to worry about anything else. So the instructions that Dogen gives us are kind of fundamental guide for this activity that we're engaged in. And once we have, as Dogen says later, like the, what is it, like the tiger entering the mountain, then that's just the natural home of Zazen, and we don't have to worry about it. So then he says, it is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. Now, when you're sitting Zazen, it may not feel like the Dharma gate of repose and bliss. Nevertheless, this is something interesting. It's kind of like a koan if you're going to think about it. What is the Dharma gate of repose and bliss? So I would say that if we let our thinking mind go, remember, think, not thinking. If we let our thinking mind go and we just presence ourselves for what's happening, that in and of itself is going to alleviate a lot of stress that we have about what's going on, particularly what's happening in Zazen. So it doesn't mean that we no longer have problems. It doesn't mean that we have no pain in Zazen, but it means that we're relieved of a kind of suffering, a kind of mental suffering that comes from trying to categorize or force things into being a certain way. So we are relieved from that kind of suffering. And then we're freed from expectations. And that's the suffering that comes from expectations when we're sitting Zazen, or really in the rest of our lives. If we have some particular expectations and we become attached to them in a way that is unwholesome, and I would say unwholesome, again, is this kind of rigidity, then what arises out of that is suffering, because we're trying to control the situation. So either we're causing suffering to ourselves, or we're causing suffering to someone else, or we're causing suffering to both self and other by trying to force a situation into being. So we want to be free from these kinds of unwholesome expectations. Sojun Roshi comments on this section, and he said, it is the Dharma gate of repose and bliss once you let go. It's the Dharma gate of repose and bliss once you let go. But if we're not letting go, then we're trapped in this kind of suffering. So, for example, when our life comes to an end, then in this place of repose and bliss, we do not ask ourselves why this is happening to us. We don't suffer from thinking we're a victim of impermanence. Actually, I think in some ways we do suffer a lot as victims of impermanence, but because, in Buddhism, we talk a lot about impermanence, but somehow that just seems to kind of skip by all the time. Impermanence, we can't hold on to it, right? Our life is like putting your hand into a river and having the water run through your hand. It's like you just can't hold on to it. So there's this way in which if we just let it go, and this is what Sojun's saying, he said, repose and bliss once you let go. So when we're actually dying, we do not, hopefully, say to ourselves, why me? That we actually, as Buddhists, part of our practice is not why me, but actually it's why not me? And in the case of death, it's like, well, of course, me. So that we acknowledge that. And I think as we acknowledge that, a lot sort of extraneous suffering that we don't need is going to drop away. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to suffer pain or other kinds of suffering, but the suffering that we do have is going to have a certain kind of clarity that comes from realizing that this is what is happening, and that we engage our life without reservations or ideations or thoughts about what it is that should be happening versus what's actually happening. So if we can let go of the idea or let go of the attachments to, when we have really strong emotions or we have really strong thinking, we think that that's true. I remember at City Center early on when I was practicing, Tenshin Reb Anderson was giving a lecture and he said, just because you think it doesn't mean it's true. Now, how many times have we heard that phrase, right? We grow up with it. And I just had this epiphany like, oh my God, just because I think it doesn't mean it's true. Wow, that's really amazing. Because in my mind, because I was thinking it, it must be true. There's this way in which that voice in our head trumps all other voices. So I think as Buddhists, we should always come back to this as bodhisattvas, as people who want to alleviate our own suffering and the suffering of others. Just because we think it or just because we feel it, it does not mean that it's true, and that we are willing to let it go. We're willing to take a look at it. We're willing to see, is this actually what's going on in this situation? So this willingness to open ourselves up to our life just as it is, that is going to create a certain kind of clarity, our willingness to engage a certain kind of clarity. And that comes from realizing that this is what's happening in my life right now, and that we're willing to acknowledge it. That's what it means when Pema Chodron says something like, start where you are, because we never want to start where we are. We always want to start where we think we would like to be. And so then we beat ourselves up because we're not in that place, or somebody else is not in that place. We just have to ground ourselves in our life as it is right now. And that's Zazen. That's what we're doing in Zazen. We're sitting on our cushion or sitting on our chair. We can feel the chair, our feet are on the ground. Our heads are goodness knows where, and bring them back to the present moment. Just bring them back to the present moment. Bring that mind back to the present moment. So it does require effort on our part. And doing this we may be asking ourselves to let go of some attachments that we might have. Those attachments are probably going to be related to something to do with how we think a situation is, some kind of reified thoughts that we have about the nature of our experience, and that we are willing to say, just because I think it doesn't mean it's true, that we are willing to try to let go and actually see what's actually happening. And that requires effort, because what's going on in our head is often how we define the nature of the self. So to ask ourselves to let go of very strong emotions or very strong feelings, to let go of those means that we are also letting go of some way that we're defining the self. And can we do that? And we should be gentle with ourselves about that, because that's a big deal. But at the same time, we want to pay attention to that. All right. The next line is the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. So it says, the Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss. The practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. So it is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. So it says the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment, the manifestation of ultimate reality. So our realization and our practice, as Dogen says, are not separate. So our practice is an expression of realization. So the practice of Zazen, coming back to the present moment, actually experiencing the present moment, that is the practice of realization. So when we do this, we see this how of the Dharma's turning as our own birth and death, and as all things that happen in between. So this way of coming back is how we see how things are actually unfolding as best we can. And when we do that, we're not caught. That's why he says the next line is, he says, traps and snares can never reach it. Traps and snares in Buddhism are like getting caught. It's usually a reference to like birds being caught in a trap. So, he says this fundamental returning, this fundamental letting go, in which we have this kind of discerning mind that's clear-eyed, this way of being and grounding ourselves in our lives means that we cannot get caught. But of course, we do get caught. We get caught in traps and snares all the time. But if we keep coming back with this Zazen mind, they can't keep us trapped. And then we get trapped again. And then we come back. We go, oh, I'm free. No, I'm trapped. So this way that we keep just coming back and applying the practice, this Dharma gate, over and over again to the experience that we're having, especially when we're experiencing suffering. I think it's really important at that point. So this totally culminated enlightenment and manifestation of ultimate reality, the two of them are not different from each other. To totally culminate enlightenment and manifestation of ultimate reality means that usually, I think how we can understand this in one way is to say, totally culminate enlightenment usually would be attributed to personhood, right? We think of persons as being enlightened. Manifestation of ultimate reality is something, the totality of universal functioning. What is enlightenment except this way in which we ground ourselves in our daily life, which is the same thing as the manifestation of ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is not different than your daily life. If it were different than your daily life, how could we practice? We can only practice in our life as it is right now. If it were some woo-woo state, like, I don't know, going to Mars or something, then we would have no relationship to it. This is only our daily life playing out as ultimate reality. And this ultimate reality is when we manifest that, this is the Bodhisattva vow coming forward. This is the vow of be this willingness to really be present for what's happening and to ask ourselves, what is it? What is it? What is this? And that we say, how does that go? And Inmo Dogen says, if you want to be a person such as they, be a person such as them or they. I think I got that wrong, but essentially what he's saying is that if we want to be manifesting the Bodhisattva way or the Buddha mind, we are already the Bodhisattva way or the Buddha mind. So manifest that aspect of yourself by grounding yourself in your life as it is and trying to actually be present for that life and respond from that place. And isn't that just what we're doing in Zazen? So these traps and snares become unencumbered, we become unblocked, and we have this kind of clear, skillful response. And then we can incorporate our own difficulties and others' difficulties and respond with compassion and wisdom. Shantideva, Guide to the Bodhisattva Way, he talks about ways that we cultivate this Bodhisattva practice. And in particular, he has a chapter on patience, which I particularly like. I found it very helpful in my life. But, one of the things he basically says is put yourself in the other person's shoes, actually look and see maybe what is this other person experiencing. So I know what I'm experiencing, but that I also extend to that other person a kind of compassion of realizing that the causes and conditions of their life also bring to them to a certain point, just as the causes and conditions of my life have brought me to a certain point. And that from that, we cultivate a kind of empathy and compassion for realizing that I'm in the same boat that that person is in. It may not be exactly the same causes and conditions. They may be manifesting a separate and different looking causes and conditions, But as human beings, we are all caught in the same causes and conditions. We're all manifesting the same causes and conditions. So that means, in a kind of more practical way, when somebody else does something that bugs me, the chances are good that I'm doing something that bugs somebody else. And they may not be the same thing, but that doesn't mean that what we're doing is any less than what the other person is doing. But we like to think about, well, we don't think about what it is that we're doing. We always think about what it is that they're doing. But consider what it is that we're doing. So it's like we're also doing annoying things, just like that other person is doing annoying things. And wouldn't we like people to be generous with us about the things that we're doing that are annoying? So that we realize that, and that we can bring those two things together and create a kind of wisdom and compassion and empathy that arises out of that realization. So that's one of the teachings that Shantideva talks about. So the next part is, he says, once its heart is grasped, you are like the dragon when they gain the water, like the tiger when they enter the mountain. You're like the dragon when they gain the water, like the tiger when they enter the mountain. For you must know that just there, in Zazen, the right Dharma is manifesting itself, and that from the very first, dullness and distraction are struck aside. So when we find this repose and bliss, when we have these moments of clarity, when we are sitting there, completely presencing ourselves, this is the heart grasped. This is the heart, the essence of this practice, that we are actually having this moment of experiencing it. And by the way, I would say that when the heart is grasped, we don't know that it's grasped. So we're not saying to ourselves, oh, I've just grasped the heart. You know, we're just experiencing that moment of clarity, of being present. So he says, once its heart is grasped, you are like the dragon when they gain the water, like the tiger when they enter the mountain. So this is this, you are home. You have this attained the state of homeness. I have a degree in theater, and I took acting classes, and I wasn't very good at it. And partly because I was so self-conscious doing this. But I had an acting teacher who was from, I don't know, somewhere like Yugoslavia or Poland or something like that. And she would say, you must be comfortable. You must be comfortable, like that. I remember that. And so that was her instruction for acting, right? Which was that we have to learn how to actually relax. Like when you're on stage, you've memorized these lines, you know what your blocking is. But at some point, you have to step off that 100-foot pole and just respond. Good actors just respond. So somebody says their lines to you, and it's like you hear it for the first time. And you do your blocking like for the first time. And then you're comfortable. Like when you're acting and somebody holds out a cup like this, and they're like this, is when you have to put your hand out like this. They're like, oh my goodness, stop, you know. But being comfortable is being able to just hold it out there and it doesn't move. So this way, can we find a way to be comfortable in our lives? Can we find this way to be like the tiger and to be like the dragon? Also, the interesting thing about tigers and dragons is tigers and dragons are strong. Tigers and dragons aren't milquetoast beings. They really do have this way, you know, this kind of, well, they're predators, but maybe I shouldn't say that. You know, they're both associated with them with some kind of wisdom and stability. And really, you know, they are here, you know, I'm a dragon and a tiger. So this kind of practice includes when we are sitting like a mountain, right? We're sitting like a mountain. So our lives are like a mountain. Let our lives be like a mountain and truly sit and be at home as those mountains, as those tigers. And at the same time, that we have a kind of gentleness about it, a flexibility about it, that we try to find clarity in the midst of that. And then Dogen ends this section with he says, when you arise from sitting, move slowly and quietly, calmly and deliberately. Do not rise suddenly or abruptly. So this is an instruction for sitting, but it's also an instruction for our life, right? He says, you know, when you arise from sitting or when you arise or decide to take action, right? When we decide to take action in our life, move slowly and quietly. You know, when I sit down to give the talk, I spend a lot of time arranging my robes and doing the various things. And why not pay attention to that? Like, why not pay attention to how my okesa fits across my lap? This is part of Soto practice. All priests do it in Soto Zen. It's not like I have some corner in the market of this, but you know, what are we doing here? You know, we are arranging our lives in a certain way. We are taking care of business, and taking care of business includes making sure that your robes, your okesa, which is for us a sacred garment, that your okesa is spread out on your knees and that it's arranged in order. So Dogen says, when you arise from sitting, move slowly and quietly, calmly and deliberately. When we decide to do something, pay attention. Pay attention. How does this impact not just ourselves, but other people around us? So this is an instruction here for not just sitting, but also for our life. Thank you very much.